rejecting that which is bad, preserving and adding up all that is good, silently and insensibly working whenever and wherever opportunity offers. We see nothing of these slow changes in progress until the hand of time has marked the long lapse of ages, and then so imperfect is our view into long past geological ages that we only see that the forms of life are now different from what they formerly were. The natural selection is familiar. This is the way animals are. This is why animals and plants are the way that they are. I believe that modern animals, any animal you look at, carries signals from the past which tell us of the natural selection pressures which led to its being the way it is. Now, since these signals come from very different distances into the past, from very old to slightly less old and so on, the genetic book of the dead must be a palimpsest. A palimpsest is an ancient manuscript which is then overwritten, rubbed out or partially erased, and then written over, and then erased again, written over, because the genetic book of the dead is a record from a very large number of different periods from the past.
And some of the most obvious examples of this writing of evolutionary history onto an animal is probably camouflage. It's probably the most obvious way of explaining what you're talking about.
That's absolutely right. A camouflaged animal almost literally has a description of its environment on its back, or rather of its ancestral environment on its back, which probably is the present environment as well. The first illustration in the book is a desert lizard from the Mojave Desert, not far from here. And the lizard has more or less literally painted on its back a picture of small pebbles, small stones and sand, which of course is why it merges into the desert, which is why you can't easily see it. Now, my thesis is that this is only the tip of the iceberg, that camouflage is the obvious, superficial way in which the animal is a description of ancestral worlds, in this case the desert. But this must be true right the way through the animal, right the way through every bit of the animal, every detail of the interior of the animal, which is not obvious in the way that the outer skin is.
Those non-obvious examples are of interest to me because something really clicks when you consider that looking at one of these animals with camouflage, you can basically know what its location would have looked like were it living thousands of years ago. But as you say, that's quite an obvious example. How do we read this book, to use your analogy, when it comes to less visual things like genes, things like other kind of more minute qualities of an animal?
Yes, this is really an exercise for the future. I'm projecting into the future when a zoologist of the future will be able to do that. And whereas today we're pretty much limited to the external appearance of the animal, that's the tip of the iceberg. I'm trying to provoke biologists to think about the interior of the animal in the same sort of way. And there are chapters on convergent evolution, on divergent evolution. There are various chapters which I'm kind of feeling my way towards getting into the genetic book of the dead, but it really is a matter of an appeal to future scientists.
Is there anything currently in human beings that we can observe that gives us an indication of the ancestral environment that they evolved in? What are some examples of things that we can observe in humans today?
Well, I suppose the fact that we have back pain, which is an indication that we used to...
Some of us,
many of us have back pain. I actually don't. I'm rather fortunate in this respect, but I know many people who do. And this is almost certainly because we were never made to walk, we were never meant to walk on our hind legs. We've only been walking on our hind legs for the last probably 4 million years or so. And so we are quadrupeds and our backbone is now protesting at being thrust into the upright position. So this is a signal from the past.
Yes.
A painful one.
I do sometimes have back pain for what it's worth. It can feel like we've been walking for 4 million years sometimes. There are some interesting examples of what you might call evolutionary blunders of this kind. I think my favourite is the laryngeal nerve.
Yes. Well, I suppose the backbone is one, but there are some much more spectacular examples than that. You mentioned the laryngeal nerve. This is a nerve, it's one of the cranial nerves. It's a branch of the 10th cranial nerve, the vagus, which starts in the brain, and it goes, the end organ is the larynx. But it doesn't go straight to the larynx, it goes down into the chest, loops its way around a big artery in the chest, and then goes straight back up again to the larynx. Now, I've assisted in the dissection of this nerve in a giraffe, and it's a very substantial detour, and would have been even bigger in a sauropod dinosaur, and with possibly adverse effects. Now, this is manifestly bad design. Any designer would have been sacked if they had wired up the nerve in this way. It's a historical accident. It comes from the fact that in our fish ancestors, many millions of years ago, the nerve went directly to, it wasn't the larynx, the fish don't have a larynx, it went directly to one of the gill arches. And in those days, the most direct route was south of that aorta. And then when the neck started to lengthen, when mammals, when land vertebrates started to elongate the neck, then the nerve, the detour, each slight increase in the detour, the marginal cost of each slight increase in the detour was so small that it wasn't worth, so to speak, it wasn't worth jumping it over that artery. The embryological cost, the cost of changing the embryology so that the nerve took a completely different route was greater than the marginal cost of each tiny little increment in the detour. Putting it another way, any individual... Hello? I didn't hear that. Did you hear that?
See me after class, whoever that was. I think.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that. It was probably a very profound observation, but I didn't get it. The marginal cost of each slight increase was very small, so that an individual that radically changed its embryology to jump the nerve over the artery would have suffered, would have probably died, compared to a rival individual who just increased the detour by a millimeter.
This is also why Richard Dawkins is banned from the local zoo. I'm interested in some of the more mysterious paintings on these animals. As far as I'm aware, we're not quite sure why zebras have black and white stripes in the way that they do.
That's right, and that's a very interesting question. I mean, on the face of it, they look very conspicuous, but actually, if you actually see them out on the plains of Africa, they don't look conspicuous. There are various theories for what that's all about, including bewildering insects that don't know what to do and where to bite. But I'm not sure if I believe that. I think they probably are rather well camouflaged from a distance.
But do you worry that this scientist of the future, SOF, as you abbreviate in the book, might run into blunders of this kind, thinking that, I mean, the idea is that we can look at an animal and not have to do any geology to work out the environment in which it evolved. If somebody looked at a zebra today, today, they might sort of think, well, maybe this animal grew up in some kind of strange, stripy world.
That's right. There's a serious danger of being sort of too clever by half and jumping to conclusions and not testing the ideas. Sometimes it's rather difficult to test them. And that is going to be a problem which SOF, the scientist of the future, will have to face, not to be too glib in jumping to a plausible conclusion.
Are there any other examples of these mysterious animal qualities that we don't really know why they are the way they are?
Probably, yes. I imagine the audience might suggest some.
None come to mind.
Yes. Do you have any ideas?
Oh, I don't know how any of this works.
Yes. I
have no idea.
I mean, there are. It's it's not that difficult to say I'm completely baffled by why the animal has this particular quality, and it's tempting to say, oh well, maybe God did it, or sort of thing. But I think a better response is, well, we don't know, and we need to work on it, and it probably might make a good PhD study.
Yeah, and things like that laryngeal nerve, sort of simultaneously good evidence of evolution and natural selection, and also evidence counting against proactive design.
Yes,
really in the process.
When it's manifestly bad design like that, I mean, another probable example is the vertebrate retina being back to front. The camera eye is obviously a very good design. The idea of having a dark chamber with a lens at the front and a real image being projected upside down onto a field of light-sensitive cells, the retina. Mollusks have a camera eye, and cephalopod mollusks, octopuses and squids, have a rather advanced camera eye, comparable to our own. And in their case, the light-sensitive cells, the nerves from those cells come off them backwards to the brain, as they should, as any good designer would have wired them up. Ours don't do that. Vertebrate retinas have the wires that lead from the light-sensitive cells coming from the front, getting in the way of the light, and the nerves go all over the retina, and then they dive through the retina in the so-called blind spot into the optic nerve. Once again, obvious bad design. The great German physiologist Helmholtz said that if he'd been presented with the vertebrate eye by an engineer, he would have sent it back.
It's interesting. A lot of people say that evolution by natural selection is consistent with something like intelligent design. It's just that this is the method that God chose to create these animals. But here you're undermining not just the end result, which is undeniably impressive, but the very method by which it came about.
Yes. Yes, well, God would not have produced such bad design as the laryngeal nerve. The other thing about that is that you can't help feeling that if this is the way God did it, why did he choose a way that made him unnecessary?
Maybe it's just that Christian humility, who knows? Yes, I do sometimes ask God, I don't often pray, but sometimes I do ask him about that back pain every now and again. I'm interested in this, you mentioned convergent evolution. I know that recently you looked into a phenomenon called carcinization, I think is how you pronounce it. It's been described as L.A. Borradaile, the biologist, as, quote, the many attempts of nature to evolve a crab. It seems that in at least a great deal of cases, crabs keep cropping up as if there's something in the world which is pointing to crabs as the pinnacle of at least some forms of evolution.
Yes, this is a nice one. This is not in the book, by the way. The crustaceans are built like a train with trucks going all the way from front to back segments, and each segment has pretty similar design, but it varies. In some primitive crustaceans, all the segments are the same except the front end and the back end. In something like a lobster or a crayfish, they're all different, but you can see that they're all basically the same kind of design, and they either have claws or they have legs or they have swimmerets in the abdomen. Crabs do a rather weird thing. They more or less dispense with the abdomen altogether, and they curl it up, and it's very small, and they curl it up underneath the main carapace. So they have truncated, they've shortened the basic design of a crustacean. And it looks as though this has happened many times, maybe half a dozen separate times. Crustaceans have converged upon the crab way of doing things. It's not that unusual. I mean, convergent evolution is fascinating, and there's a whole chapter on convergent evolution, and crabs is just one rather nice example.
Yeah, I think that the many attempts of nature to evolve a crab might have been putting it a bit dramatically. I've seen people quite scared that human beings are sort of inevitably going to evolve into crabs one day, but I think we can put that to bed.
That's putting it too strongly. You want to start off as a crustacean if you want to become a crab.
Indeed.
I just remember that in H.G. Wells's Time Machine, the time traveller goes forward in time eventually, a long way forward, and the only creature he sees is giant crabs. So maybe
there's something in this. Are there any other interesting examples of convergent evolution? That is, animals independently seeming to converge on particular qualities?
Yes. Well, one nice one is pill bugs, wood lice, which are very familiar. If you see a wood lice, the chances are it's not a wood lice, it could very well be a millipede, because there are millipedes which have converged upon the wood louse way of life, and they look exactly the same as wood lice. You can only tell the difference, I can only tell the difference if I turn them over, and then they have too many legs. But otherwise they look exactly like wood lice, and they curl up into a ball just like pill bugs do. But I think the most spectacular examples perhaps are the Australian marsupial mammals. When the great southern continent of Gondwana broke up, and Africa and South America and Antarctica and Australia all went their separate ways, Australia was dealt a hand of marsupials. The only mammals there were marsupials, and so marsupials then diverged to produce a whole range of different types: carnivores and herbivores, large ones, small ones, digging ones, climbing ones, etc. And these parallel the same kinds of creatures that we have in the old world. So in Australia there are marsupial dogs, or there were until they went extinct, thylacines, marsupial rabbits, marsupial moles, marsupial mice, etc. So any kind of trade, any kind of way of life you can think of in a mammal, you go to Australia and you find the same thing, but independently evolved, independently converging upon the what we're familiar with. So a marsupial mole looks like a mole, it has the same way of life as a mole, it has digging, it crawls through the sand in the same sort of way as a mole does. The mole way of life, by the way, has converged at least 4 times, not just in Australia and Europe and Eurasia. In Africa, there are so-called golden moles, which again are entirely independently converged upon the mole way of life.
Something you address in the book is a question that might actually also be helpful for the evolution skeptics that we've just learned are prominent in America, which is this question of, we can apply it specifically to something like camouflage. There are animals, for example, the owl butterfly, which seems to have these great big eyes that it can reveal on its back to scare off predators. It's extraordinary. Again, there are pictures in the book, I think, and you can look it up online. It's incredible to see these realistic eyes on the back of an animal, on the back of a butterfly. And a lot of people want to ask, how does this evolve? In the sense that to see an eye, it's quite a complex image. It has to have sort of a center and an outer, and it seems like if you just had like a small black circle, it wouldn't really do the trick of scaring away a predator who thinks it's an eye. And so it kind of seems like in order to work, it needs to be all there at once. So
Yes.
A skeptic might say, how does this property evolve in the first place?
That is a problem. The eyes are, we call them eyes. I think they do look like eyes, and they really do, don't they? They're not just circles. They have a sort of 3D quality that looks like eyes. It's not just moths and butterflies. There are other creatures that have the same thing. If you've read the books about Baba the elephant, you may remember that the elephants under Baba had a war against the rhinoceroses. And Baba won the war by getting a whole lot of elephants to stand with their backsides facing the rhinoceroses. And he painted great big eyes on their backsides. So it's called the Baba effect. It's been worked on by a man called David Blessed, and it really does seem to scare predators. They probably don't actually think it is eyes, but something about the eye pattern is startling. You asked the question, how did it begin? I think that's the burden of your problem.
Yeah, would a half eye, would
that's
a
right.
black circle
Yes.
do the same trick?
I find that easier to answer with respect to camouflage, something like a stick insect or a stick caterpillar, where once again, nowadays, when you see a stick caterpillar, it looks just like a stick in every detail. It's got leaf scars and buds and things on it. And you have to wonder, to answer Alex's question would be, at the beginning, before it became looking like a detailed stick, how did it manage to escape the attention of predators when it was only very slightly like a stick? And I think the answer probably is that, and this doesn't apply so well to the eye spots actually, the answer probably is that seeing conditions are not always very good. And so if a predator were to catch sight of, or it'll just sort of see this incipient stick out of the corner of its eye, or in a poor light, or from a distance, that would be enough to overlook it, because it would look like sufficiently like a stick to be overlooked. And then the final perfecting stages of the evolution, when you get the detailed resemblance to a stick, that would have been put together by full frontal vision in a good light close up. I can't quite do that for the eye spots. It doesn't quite work for the eye spots, because we're talking about overlooking something rather than, when in the case of the eye spots, we're talking about being scared by a sudden appearance. By the way, I think that I've put two very scary pictures in the book. I can't decide which is the more scary, involving eyes. One is an octopus. Octopuses can change their colour instantaneously. They're unique in this. Octopus and squids and cuttlefish can change their appearance instantaneously. And so they can put on any pattern they like, and putting on eye spots is something they suddenly do. That's very scary. And then on the same page we have a vulture which has a false head with false eyes. So it looks as though there is something about eyes, and I can't really easily put together the answer to your question about the original incipient.
I think people often forget that we're talking about an extraordinarily long amount of time and marginal gains, essentially. And I mean, it could be specifically the eye shape which startles a predator, but as far as I'm aware, they can sort of suddenly reveal these eyes in a lot of cases.
Exactly what they do, yes.
Yes, and so I would imagine that any kind of sudden shift, sudden revealing of colour might be enough to startle a predator. And I think it's easier to see how, rather than trying to imagine like an eye evolving from scratch, first maybe just a pattern of colours.
Any bright pattern.
Any change.
Yes.
That will flash at them, which will scare them, and then it can slowly start sort of...
That's right. So many butterflies have rather drab pattern on the underside. And then, so that when they're just sitting with their wings closed, they look drab and brown. And then they open their wings, and immediately you see a flash of bright colour. And I suppose just a startle effect would do it.
Yeah, and so you wouldn't necessarily have to get from nothing to an eye. You could get from a sort of pattern of any sort.
A bright pattern, yes.
It seems easier to imagine that maybe morphing into an eye. But I'm interested, since we're all about evidence here, when it comes to mysteries like this, well, how exactly does the eye shape evolve on the back of a butterfly? How do we go about trying to find an answer to this? I mean, it seems like maybe somebody could come up with an interesting idea that sounds like it makes sense, and we say, oh, that probably works. But is there any sort of test that we can, in principle, run on these kinds of questions?
I suppose you can look comparatively at some species which have rather less convincing eyes than others, and some of them will just have as you say, a colour pattern with what you could perhaps discern as an eye. It is a fact, I think, that the vertebrate brain, certainly the human brain, likes to see eyes whenever it possibly can, and Do you know the illusion of the hollow face illusion? It's the most striking illusion I know. Do you know this one? You have a hollow mask, just an ordinary mask. It could be of some celebrated or infamous politician,
or both.
And if you look at it solid side on, it obviously it looks like a solid face. If you turn it to the hollow side, it looks extraordinarily like a solid face, although it's actually hollow. And if you put it on a rotating turntable, so that it's going slowly round and round and round, as the solid side comes round, it does look solid. Then when the hollow side comes into view, it suddenly clicks into place as an apparently solid face going backwards. And this is well understood. The human brain looks for faces whenever it can, looks for eyes whenever it can, and it will make eyes. There's a crater formation on the moon. I think it's on the moon. It might be on Mars. No, I think it's on the moon.
The face of Mars.
Mars. That's right. Okay. Which looks like a face, and we tend to see faces even when they're not there, and so maybe it's exploiting that.
Like other animals might have a similar thing.
Exactly.
Yes. Predators.
Well, we would expect other vertebrates to have the same illusion.
Yeah. I mean, it seems intuitively easy to imagine why human beings would evolve a tendency to see faces in things. But specifically, do we have a good idea of exactly why this quality of human beings evolved?
Well, I could make a guess. It's something to do with individual recognition. It is remarkable how no two of us look the same, or almost no two of us look the same, and identical twins do. But it is remarkable how much variation you can pack into a face.
Yeah.
There is a neurological condition, prosopagnosia, where people cannot recognize faces. It's a remarkable thing because they can see a nose, an eye, two eyes, and a mouth, and they know they're there. The chap can't recognize his own wife.
I wonder if people with that condition also are less prone to sort of, I suppose they can't see faces in things in the way that other human beings do. Like if you see two drains and a line underneath it, immediately see a face. I suppose that quality isn't there at all for that kind of person. It's interesting. But human beings now evolve in a very strange circumstance. I mean, one day we might be able to read this genetic book of the dead for human beings and get an idea of how we evolved. But it seems like now we live in a scenario of unnatural selection. We're not all just sort of facing the elements and allowing the weak to die and the strong to thrive. In many ways, society has flipped this on its head, and now we make proactive efforts to protect those who are more vulnerable to the elements. How do you suspect that this will change not only the evolutionary trajectory of human beings, but also the ability of future evolutionary historians to look at human beings and take a guess at their ancestry?
It's quite clear that we are feather-bedded in a big way from natural selection pressures. Natural selection is still going on, but in a very odd way, and the world in which we live is so much, the cultural world is so much, not only is it cultural, but it's changing at an extraordinary speed compared to biological evolution. And so if we try to look into the future and say what humans might look like in the distant future, it's really impossible to do that because the cultural changes are going to be so rapid compared to the rate at which biological evolution goes.
Of course.
That it would be very hard to predict.
It's interesting how human beings can flip natural selection on its head, at least in the short term. I mean, talking about people who go hunting, for example, whereas usually it would be the weaker animals that would die of starvation or a broken leg or something. Now human beings go out and they look for the biggest, strongest animals to kill. And so
never thought of that. Trophy hunters.
Yes. And so there are many instances like that. Like you could imagine, for example, these incredible owl butterflies. Human beings evolve and they find them quite beautiful, and maybe they start hunting them and putting them in cases, and so you end up with an evolutionary pressure if it goes on for long enough.
Yes.
To get rid of the eyes, because
yes,
now you've
actually,
got
this has been happening with elephants in Africa quite rapidly. Because trophy hunters go for and ivory hunters, of course, go for the big tuskers. So it looks as though tusks are shrinking for that reason. It's an interesting point.
Same thing can happen in fish populations with smaller fish slipping through the nets, and so
Yes.
big fish. And
Yes,
you have
yes.
this very strange
Yeah.
way in which we're dealing with, I suppose you could call it unnatural selection, or
Yes,
even
yes.
sometimes reverse natural selection. But presumably, I mean, you said it's happening rapidly in elephants. What does rapidly mean in an evolutionary context?
Well, over about a century, I think. The records from, I believe it's Uganda, looking at records of tuskers, and they're getting smaller.
Which is amazing to me, thinking about the length of time that's necessary for
It is
evolution on a grand
amazing.
scale. I'm surprised to hear it in other words
Yes,
that it's so quick.
especially since elephants are very slow reproducing.
Yes, yeah. Are there any other examples of sort of fast natural selection that we can see in action? Not necessarily this reverse unnatural selection I'm talking about, but just before our very eyes.
Yes. Well, before our very eyes is a bit of a tall order. There are the mosquitoes in the London Underground is one example.
Yeah.
But a more biologically interesting one, I suppose, is the cichlid fish of Lake Victoria. All three of the great African lakes, Victoria, Tanganyika, and Malawi, have very large populations of cichlid fish, which appear to have evolved from one or two founder populations. In the case of Lake Victoria, we know that the lake is only about 100,000 years old, which is tiny by geological standards. And yet Lake Victoria has about 450 species of cichlid fish, which appear to have evolved during that period of 100,000 years. So that's about as fast as I know of a major evolutionary change.
Yes, and those mosquitoes on the London Underground, of course, spending enough time there, have just evolved to stop talking to each other and get very impatient on escalators. Haven't we also seen this? There's something about butterflies or moths in the Industrial Revolution getting darker.
This is a well-known case. Since the Industrial Revolution in the 18th and 19th centuries, and 20th century, various animals have evolved darker coloration. This has been well worked out by Bernard Kettlewell in peppered moths, Biston betullaria. And in rural areas to this day, the majority of these moths are pale colored, and they sit on bark and are well camouflaged on pale bark. In industrial areas, like in the region around Birmingham and Manchester, where the trees are blackened from smoke from industry, the moths are predominantly black or very, very dark, and they're well camouflaged there. And Kettlewell showed with experiments and observations that is undoubtedly true that in the industrial areas, the pale-colored moths are selectively picked off by bird predators, and in the rural areas, the dark-colored moths are selectively picked off. So in a matter of a couple of 100 years, in industrial areas, we've seen an evolutionary change from light color to dark color.
Can you help us understand how this happens with the gene as the unit of selection for natural selection?
Well, in the case of industrial melanism, the genetics is well known, and it's a kind of textbook example of what happens. It is just a single gene change, and of course, to get interesting evolution, you've got to have longer than that.
Darwin was quite confused in his lifetime about how the genetics would work, given that he thought that there was a process of gene blending going on.
That's right. In Darwin's time and up until the experiments of Gregor Mendel, the Austrian monk in the 19th century, everybody thought that inheritance was blending. They thought that each child was a kind of mixture, a blend, like mixing two liquids together of the parents. And Darwin was no exception. Well, almost. I can come on to that. And this gave Darwin a lot of grief because a hostile reviewer called Fleming Jenkin, hostile reviewer of The Origin of Species, said that natural selection would be impossible because the variation would disappear and any new mutation, which we didn't call it mutation in those days, any new variant which was advantageous would soon be swamped by this blending process. The example that Fleming Jenkin used was a horrible racist example, but you don't have to do it that way. Darwin was worried by this, and little did he know the solution to the problem was buried in a German journal, the work of Gregor Mendel. Darwin's German wasn't that great, and he never came across this paper. Mendel's work was unknown until after Darwin's death, and it was rediscovered in 1900 or so. And what Mendel showed is that genetics is digital. Genes are all or none. You either get a particular gene from your parent or you do not. You either pass it on to your child or you do not. They don't blend. They go intact from grandparent to parent to child to grandchild and so on. You either get a particular gene or you don't. They never mix. They never blend. Tantalizingly, Darwin was almost onto this. There's a letter from Darwin to Wallace, who was his co-discoverer of natural selection, in which Darwin describes experiments he did on peas, which is interesting because Mendel also worked on peas. And Darwin said in his letter to Wallace that he had crossed two varieties, I forget what they were, say white and purple, I can't remember what the colours were, and he got either white or purple, either one colour or the other, but not a blend. So Darwin was onto that in the particular case of these peas. And then he said something very revealing. He said, I do not consider this any more remarkable than the fact that when you cross, he didn't put it quite this way, when you cross a male and a female, you get male or female offspring. You don't get some intermediate. So in a way, what Mendel did, and what Darwin kind of almost did, was to spot that just as sex is not blending, when you cross a male and a female, you don't get a hermaphrodite. You get either a son or a daughter. If only he'd generalized that to genetics generally. When you cross anything with anything, you don't get a blend. You get one or the other. Then he would have been able to see through the Fleming-Jenkin problem. By the way, one of the reasons why it kind of looks blending sometimes is so-called polygenes, where you have lots of different small genes with small effects, which have a summation effect. They're all digital. They're all particulate in themselves, but because there are lots of them, it looks as though they are blending.
So, for example, something like skin color, which looks
skin
like
color is a very good example. Where if you cross black and white, you tend to get an intermediate, and that's because you've got a whole lot of separate polygenes, which in themselves are particulate, and having a summated effect.
You've got a helpful analogy for this: the difference between sort of taking some coloured paint and mixing it together versus using sort of.
Well, that's right. If you take red and blue paint and mix them together, you get purple. And if you then mix purple with purple, you don't reconstruct red and blue. But in genetics, that's just what you do.
It's more like having a bunch of tiny little beads yes. of different colours.
Yes, that's what it is, and that's what Mendelian genetics is often expressed as. In the post-Watson and Crick era, we know that genetics is digital right down to its very detail. I mean, every gene is digital, but that was not known to Mendel, of course.
It's a little bit like how computer screens work in their color. There's no yellow in a lot of computer screens, I think. And
That's right. It's got these three different colors. I think it's red, blue, and green, and little pixels. Red, blue, and green, and you make any color you like by differentially amplifying these three different colors.
Yeah, they're not blending them together. They're just sort of almost tricking the eye in a way. Who is this book aimed at? I mean, it's got a lot of dense evolutionary biology, but at the same time, it's fascinating for someone like me who has not.
It's aimed at the same audience as the Selfish Gene. It's aimed at both lay people and professional biologists. John Maynard Smith, when he was reviewing the Selfish Gene and the extended phenotype, he made an observation which I was very pleased about. He said this book is rather unusual in that it's aimed at both professional biologists and at lay people. And the same is true of the Genetic Book of the Dead.
And tell me about you describe it as sort of like the sting of the book, this idea of genes as a gigantic colony, as symbiotic of viruses.
I'm a little bit embarrassed about this. The Selfish Gene had a sting in the tail, which was the last chapter, which was about memes. And this one has a sting in the tail as well, which is the proposal that we should regard all our own genes as equivalent to a gigantic colony of cooperating viruses. And this is not quite as radical as it sounds. It does not mean that a whole lot of separate viruses came together and formed a sort of cooperative like that. What it does mean is the following. I think the important distinction between parasites and, well, the important way to classify parasites is those whose hope for the future, if I can be pardoned for using that phrase, hope for the future is to get into the next host via the gametes, via the eggs or sperms of the present host. That's longitudinal transmission of parasite to the next host. That's longitudinal. Or horizontal transmission, which is like being sneezed out or coughed out or spewed out into the water supply in the form of diarrhea and then imbibed. So these are horizontal parasites which aspire to get into the next generation via some means other than the gametes of the present host. So we have longitudinal versus horizontal transmission of parasites. Now, if you think about the ambitions of a longitudinal parasite, they will be identical to the ambitions of the genes of the present host, because they want the present host to be a successful reproducer. They want the present host to produce children containing these parasitic viruses or bacteria, let's say. So any influence that these longitudinal bacteria or viruses can have on the present host will be identical to the influence that the host's own genes have. They will want the present host to be a good survivor, to be sexually attractive in order to have offspring, to be a good parent, to be good at building nests. Everything that the own genes, the animal's own genes, aspire to will be the same as what the longitudinal parasites aspire to. And therefore, you can distinguish those own genes which are rebels. There are some that are actual rebels. There are some of our own genes which aspire to cheat the system segregation distorters, they're sometimes called. There are, as you know, normally in meiosis, when you make sperms, any gene has a 50% chance, any one of your diploid genotype has a 50% chance of getting into each sperm. That's a 50% lottery, it's fair. But there are segregation distorters. There are genes whose phenotypic effect is to bias the production of sperms so that they are more likely than 50% to get into a sperm. So they are cheating the system. They have a great selective advantage, but it's to the disadvantage of the organism. So these are examples of own genes which cheat the system. And then we have viruses and bacteria which are horizontally transmitted, which are sneezed out, and they don't care if the present host survives. They may, well, then they care, it can die as long as they get passed on. So I'm making this distinction between longitudinal and horizontal transmission. The classic example of a longitudinal transmitted bacteria is mitochondria. These are, we now know that they are originally bacteria, but they are now vital to our survival. All our cells contain these tiny particles called mitochondria. They have their own genes, they have their own circular genome, like a bacterium. They are bacteria originally. And they pass through the egg, they pass down the female line via the egg, so that they, insofar as they have any effect, their genes have any effect on the host, it will be in the same direction as the host's own genes. So this leads me to this sort of slightly fanciful, sting-in-the-tail conclusion that we can regard our own genes as cooperating with each other to produce the body only because they have the same interests, only because they have the same exit route from the present, let's call it host, the present individual, into the next generation. So they are a cooperative of would-be independent agents, and the only reason they're not independent, the only reason they work together in a collaborative way, which they do, is that they have the same route into the future. And therefore we can think of them as equivalent to a gigantic colony of viruses.
You call this it's a helpful way of thinking about it. You call it the sting in the tail. Do you think this is controversial? Do you think it's upsetting?
Well, I think that virologists might think that it's not really what they would mean by a virus. I mean,
it's not nice to think that we're riddled with viruses either, I suppose.
Yes, I mean, actually, about 8% of our genome really is originally viral. But I'm not talking about that. I'm generalizing it to the whole lot. Mm. So it's the sort of thing I do, and
yeah, it's hardly the most upsetting thing that you've written in your career. I mean, so much for having a sting in the tail of your books. I think that at least one of them was really just itself one big sting. I know that, and by the way, in about 10 minutes, we will be taking audience questions, so get thinking. A lot of people will probably want to ask about that other aspect of your career, which is, of course, religion, atheism, the God delusion. And you're so often accused of creating a vacuum. You turn a bunch of people into atheists, you create this vacuum that other ideas come into. And I know you've been asked that a bunch of times, and I imagine that you quite recoil at the accusation that that's what you're doing, because I've seen you answer before and say that, well, you're against all kinds of nonsense. It doesn't matter where the nonsense comes from, you're against it. The question I wanted to ask you was, even if you are still condemning the nonsense that comes to fill this void that is potentially created as people give up one religion for another, even if you still condemn that thing which fills this place, if we determine that that thing is worse, less preferable than, say, something like Christianity, which might have been there before, do you still feel any level of responsibility? Do you think you can be indicted for those ideas, even if you personally think that they are nonsense?
This is an interesting thing, and I, as you say, I have often met it. I think you have two schools of thought. If you have two different kinds of nonsense, is it better to arm yourself with a weaker kind of nonsense against a stronger kind? Or is it better to be against all nonsense? And I'm of the latter school of thought. But I do sympathise in a way with, I think, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, before her recent conversion, sincere conversion, I suspect, to Christianity, I think she did go through a phase of regarding Christianity as a kind of armament against something worse, which is Islam. I sometimes quote Hilaire Belloc's couplet, always keep a hold of nurse for fear of finding something worse. And I think that's what may have motivated her originally to be sympathetic towards Christianity. I don't go down that route. I think that I believe in evidence-based truth, and so I think that all religions and all superstitions, and including much of what is now sometimes called wokeness, are equally reprehensible, and I'm against them all.
I'm not sure if it's easy to quantify which you are more suspicious of or more worried about in society, but I mean, it's easy enough to be against these ideas, but to be clear, I mean, if you could snap your fingers and tomorrow everybody in the United States became an atheist, would you do it?
Yes, I would. This was a question which was put to Christopher Hitchens, and he said no, because he loves arguing, I think. But I would say yes.
There's a clip, you can watch it online, of Christopher Hitchens talking about this, and he says, you know, if I were given the opportunity, he says he was asked, if I were given the opportunity, there's one person left, I could deconvert them, I wouldn't do it. And he says, you know, of course he loves the argument, but he says in that car ride, it's with Doug Wilson in the back of the car, he says, but there is that, but it's not just that, there's just something about it. And he said, I said this to Richard Dawkins, and the look of incredulity that he gave me remains with me, is what he said. I mean, wouldn't you be a little bit sort of sentimental? Wouldn't you want to sort of preserve it for its own sake as a cultural artifact? Would you really sort of take that last, probably not
yes,
particularly influential...
I do value, and I've said this often, I do value Christian literature. I value the literary heritage that we have from the Bible and the Book of Common Prayer. You can't take your illusions in reading English literature if you don't know the Bible. And so I wouldn't wish people to be uneducated in the existence of religion. I do take exception to teaching children this is what you believe because you are a Catholic or a Muslim, whatever it is. But I do think that children should be educated about religion.
There you have it, folks. Richard Dawkins says, read your Bible. Just after Christopher Hitchens died, an author called Larry Taunton wrote a book called The Faith of Christopher Hitchens, in which, I haven't read it, he claims that near the end of Christopher Hitchens' life, he maybe started to flirt with religio-spirituality in a way that might surprise some of his followers. It was a controversial volume. A lot of people came out and condemned it. I wondered perhaps what your thoughts are on that, but also, are you concerned that people might try to do something like that with you?
I have read it. I think it's a disgraceful book. It does takes advantage of he took advantage of a long car journey he had with Christopher Hitchens, and I think Christopher was probably being polite and talking seriously to him about his religion, and I don't. People do the same thing with Darwin. You probably read there was a woman called Lady Hope who called on Darwin when he was very old and dying. Well, we'll say very old, younger than I am, but anyway. And she described how Darwin opened the Bible and there was beautiful sort of sunlight on his hand. He said how wonderful it was. It was all lies. It was debunked by Darwin's son, Francis. There is a risk that the religious apologists are so eager to get deathbed conversions that you have
He's just
to
fucking
watch it.
insecure.
I hereby, well, actually, Christopher said, I think he himself said, that if anybody claims that I had a deathbed conversion, you can be absolutely sure that I wasn't in my right mind when it happened. Now, I will not have a deathbed conversion, I think.
We're approaching the question and answer period, ladies and gentlemen. There is going to be a microphone which will be placed just about here, and we're going to have people queuing along the front and up the side of the theatre, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Just before we do that, there's a question I wanted to ask you absent of the Q&A here, but maybe it will be instructive. What is, across your illustrious career, your least favourite question that you're most commonly asked?
I think it could be the free will question. I'm nearly always asked, do you think we have free will? And I usually resort to Christopher Hitchens' answer, do I have free will? I have no choice.
Yes, as a free will skeptic myself, I sometimes wish that Christopher Hitchens had at least a deathbed version on that particular point. I think it's time to go for Q&A. We're going to do about 30 minutes, and we're going to have you queuing up here. I think somebody's going to have a microphone. I don't know where it is or who's going to place it there. We're going to turn up the lights. If you want to come down and start queuing up, I think it's going to be right in the aisle here, but I'm not sure where the... Is it on the other side? It's down. Oh, I see. Okay, I can see.
Okay, so this have to.
Now,
this gotta
we
confirm
want to make
to
sure
the
that
shape that is
people have
on.
time to
So if
ask their
light
questions. We
is
want to make sure we
here,
get to as many
this
as
is
possible.
supposed to
And
continue.
so we're going to request that the questions are as brief and pointed as possible, if possible punctuated with a question mark at the end of them. And also, the theatre is a little bit echoey, so we may not be able to hear you very well, and I might need to repeat your questions if that's the case. But try to speak as clearly as, and I suppose as slowly as possible. But with that, I think we can go to the first question.
Okay.
Can we have the lights a bit brighter?
Right. Perhaps that's as bright as they go.
I was recently talking to my uncle who lives in India, and he mentioned an article that he read, and the question is, I recently read an article about research which shows that Florida carpenter ants perform amputations on injured ants, and also that they do it only in case of thigh injuries and not lower leg injuries, as lower leg injuries have a very short window for successful amputations and survival.
Sorry, can you start again, because I think we've just got sound out of these fancy monitors.
So my uncle was wondering, I recently read an article about research which shows that Florida carpenter ants perform amputations on injured ants, and also that they do it only in case of thigh injuries and not lower leg injuries, as lower leg injuries have a very short window for successful amputation and the survival rate is not great. How can evolution explain the emergence of such complex behaviors and learning in ants?
I don't think there's a particular problem with that, is there? I understand that ants cut off their legs, did you say?
Yes, they perform amputations for other members.
For other members. I don't know about this. This is a good example of what we were talking about earlier, where you don't necessarily understand it because you don't know enough about it, and it's a good PhD project. But the use of the word amputation already is loaded. It suggests that it was done for surgical reasons, to benefit the ant whose legs were cut off. For all I know, they were eating them. I just don't know. I don't know enough about it. I think ants do remarkable things as social insects for the good of the colonies, more strictly for the good of the genes of the queen. And I would need to know a lot more to know why they're doing it, what benefit it has to the colony. So I can't answer your question. Which is a good thing in a scientist, by the way.
Thank you.
Well, please don't bother to applaud.
It's that Christian humility again, I suppose.
My question is for both of you gentlemen. I've heard that the internet, but the question involves epistemology. I heard that the internet has been compared to the Gutenberg printing press from several hundred years ago. Given that the internet has a propensity to allow people to spread nonsense and pseudoscientific thinking in as much as knowledge, do you believe that this analogy is accurate and how it affects our truth-seeking processes in the future with the advance of our technology?
Well, the analogy with the printing press is a good one, and when you say the fact that the internet can spread nonsense as well as sense, the same is true of the printing press, of course. The printing press has always spread nonsense as well as sense. So yes, I think it's a very good analogy, and as for what we can do about it, that's rather more difficult. I think one of the things that my foundation and the Centre for Inquiry tries to do is to spread critical thinking, thinking based upon evidence, and to try to instruct people in skeptical, critical thinking. But it's a hard uphill struggle.
Well, I think perhaps one difference is the advent of manipulative algorithms in the case of social media. But I still think that the printing press is a good analogy. It might not be just a continuation of the same process, but it's a good analogy to try to get to the root of how revolutionary an idea that we're talking about. It is of a different kind because of the algorithmic process, but even then, the books that you would be able to read would be determined by things like the university you were in, what books it had in its library. Books were expensive, people didn't have a lot of them, and so there were still pressures in terms of what you were going to read that would be influenced by the friends you had that you could borrow books from, the university that you were studying in. There'd still be some kind of process by which that would affect what you see and what you're able to read. Obviously completely unimaginably smaller than manipulative algorithms, but perhaps a difference of degree rather than kind, and still for that reason a useful analogy, if not an exact forerunner of what we're seeing.
I suppose you could emphasize the fact that the has been subject to sort of not put it mildly.
By and large, yeah. They are quite different, and they might be different in kind for that reason. So it's only a useful analogy up to a point, as all analogies probably are.
Okay.
Hey Richard, so you spent most of your career debunking the God delusion, but don't you think there's another very common delusion, which is the ethnicity delusion? Because in my opinion, the way ethnicities exist today, I feel like we can make better ethnicities, because ethnicities today exist just because people live together for a long time and, create a common culture, right? But what if we could create ethnicities based on some common values and common goals in the future? And I feel like people obviously want to form tribes together. There's something in our brains that makes us want to do it. But I feel like some ways of forming tribes are better than others. And is it possible to also ask one question to Alex?
I think we'd rather have just one at a time, and especially nobody's paid to see me here.
Yeah,
So
no worries.
see me afterwards, perhaps.
No worries.
Well, the tendency to tribalism is a very interesting quality of humans, and I think one of the things we're seeing now is that the tribalism doesn't only apply to ethnicity; it can apply to opinion, and we tend to be dividing into what look horribly like warring tribes in political opinion at the moment. And so I completely agree with you about ethnicity, but I think you were also making the point about tribalism, and that's the maybe this is part of the effect of the internet, is to divide us into warring tribes, where the opinions that we hold are often not based upon evidence, but instead are based upon the tribe to which we think we belong, whether it's Republicans, Democrats, or whatever it is.
Yeah, as I was saying, like some ways of forming tribes, I feel like are better than others. Like some
Yes.
have purpose,
Yes.
some are just
I think that
accidents.
maybe the next question. Thank you. It's a shame we don't have more time, I'm afraid, but we want to get to as many as we can.
Thank you, Professor. Hi, I'm an elementary school teacher and I teach science as a part of my core curriculum. I've often found that phenomenon, like the moth example you gave me earlier, is a great way of teaching students how to engage and look at the world. What advice would you have for me or other educators in continuing to keep that innate sense of wonder and interest in students?
Yes, Alex asked me what question I hate most, and I think I said I forgot to say the "what advice would you give" question. As though I was some kind of guru. I don't know. I mean, you're a science teacher. I applaud you as a science teacher of the sciences, so say you're going about the right way. Just be honest and don't stand for nonsense. Do you have a problem with children of creationist parents?
Yeah, I work in a very religious community and I often get pushed back on, oh, you're teaching my child anti this, that, or the other.
And is your career would your career be endangered if you teach something that the parents object to?
No, there's strong job protections for me as a teacher, so that's nice. But
Well, that's good, because I've heard from other teachers that they actually do have to watch what they say, because the children will go home and complain to their parents, and then complain to the head teacher, who then has the biology teacher up on the carpet and tells them not to offend the pupils. Well, I think pupils need to be offended in some circumstances. It does them good.
Thank you. Thank you for your service.
Good evening, Richard. I'm an atheist just like you. So it did confuse me when you referred to Christianity as fundamentally decent. My question to you is this. Christianity has a deep track record of inspiring hate and countless other human rights violations and atrocities. So what do you attribute that to, if not the fundamentals? And whatever your answer is, why do you not allow that same leniency to Islam?
Well, I think certainly Christianity in the past has an appalling record, and not that long ago, but certainly in medieval times, Christianity had an appalling record. But it's just that nowadays Islam is somewhat worse, that's all. I mean, Christians don't throw gay people off high buildings, they don't impose a death penalty for apostasy, they don't kill women for the crime of being raped, which is what you get in places where Islam has sway over the government or the people.
Mm-hmm.
But my question was about the fundamentals. You said it's fundamentally decent. And what do you think caused the things in the past that you find horrible about Christianity? If it wasn't the fundamentals, what was it?
The absolute faith that what you believe is correct, not because it's based upon evidence, but because it's handed down by tradition, by revelation, by faith. Faith is a great evil. Faith is belief in something which has no evidence in its favor.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have faith in something, then it's impossible to argue against it. And that's fundamentally what the problem has always been with the evils of religion. That's why it's possible for religions to persecute heretics, which they've done throughout the ages.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say that Christianity is a fundamentally decent religion?
Only by comparison with Islam.
Nice.
Yeah, hi, good evening. First of all, you can add me to your list of people you're meeting on this tour whose lives has been changed by your writing. In my case, it was The Blind Watchmaker, I think 1986. I haven't been the same since. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
A question about education. I was pleased to hear about the Institute for Teachers, Evolutionary Science. What about religion in the sense that I was brought up Catholic, elementary school, high school, until I realized that everybody else had different religions and they all believed theirs was the true one, and then it just all sort of puffed away. Now my children and grandchildren know nothing about religion because they've been to just public schools. So we sort of have this bipolar kind of situation. Are there countries where this is done correctly, where children learn about the world's religions and how they develop, what they have in common, what they don't? And because without understanding religion, that's part of our species.
Yes, I think that's right. And I think that's what I said earlier, that we ought to be educating children in religion. It's part of, as you say, it's part of the history of our species. You can't understand the history of warfare. So many wars have been based on religion, for example. And also, as I said before, to understand the literature, you need to be educated in religion. What is evil is teaching children what to believe, because that's the tradition in which their families have always believed. And
anywhere in the world in sort of a reasonable way that you know of?
I don't know. It wouldn't surprise me, but I'm not an expert in such things. I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Thank you for being here. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the legacy of the late Daniel Dennett, maybe your favorite idea of his.
He was a wonderful man. I looked up to him as a kind of elder brother. He was actually a year younger than me, but I sort of I thought of him as a sort of go-to person to sort out muddled thinking. He was witty, he was wise, wonderful friend. What are his best ideas? Well, he wrote so much. I mean, the philosophy of mind, evolution, his idea of intuition pumps. Just a wonderful thinker, an example of, to me, a justification of the existence of philosophy. I mean, he was, if ever I needed to be persuaded that philosophers were a good thing, Daniel Dennett was the reason.
You hear a lot these days about life having meaning and life having purpose, and I don't think it needs to be the case. And I wonder just what your opinion was on life having to have meaning or purpose. People have a purpose.
Well, I think that life is a very good thing if you do have meaning and purpose in your life. I certainly do myself. What is wrong, I think, is to think that there has to be a purpose in everything. And there are people who say that things like, well, I understand the how of the universe, and what's the why? What's the purpose of it? What's the meaning of it? And that, I think, has no answer. There's no reason why there should be a purpose in any particular. There's no purpose in the universe. There's no purpose in mountains. There's no purpose in earthquakes. They just happen for the reason that they happen, and the laws of physics dictate that they happen. But in terms of our own lives, we have purposes, and our brains are made by natural selection to set up purposes, and we all have purposes all the time, and our life has meaning because we give it meaning. Different people have different meanings in their life, but I think it's one of the glories of being human that we can have meaning in our lives, which rises above the more basic meaning that life has, which is simply to propagate your DNA.
Hi, I grew up in the Czech Republic. I moved here 2 years ago, and I've watched you since middle school, and I never thought I'd get the chance to see you live, so I just want to say thank you for doing this tour. My question is, in recent years, we've seen a rise in cosmetic procedures, many of which haven't been observed in terms of long-term effects. As an evolutionary biologist, what are your thoughts on how the prevalence of these procedures might influence human development and evolution?
I missed the key word. Procedures, what was the key word before?
Cosmetic procedures.
Cosmetic.
Cosmetic.
Cosmetic procedures.
Like what?
Like
I'm just...
Like BBLs, for example.
Like what?
Things like Botox.
Like Botox.
Like Botox.
Oh, Botox.
Yeah.
I don't think I have any views on it. What did you apply this to evolution in some way?
Yeah, I mean, people are going under the knife, changing the way that they look. I think it is relevant to evolution, or can be, which is why I'm asking you the question, because
well, I mean, yes, it's not strictly relevant because, of course, it's a non-genetic procedure, and so it's I suppose it's just an extreme generalization of wearing clothes and having hairstyles and things like that, in the sense that it's actually surgical. But I don't think an evolutionist has any particular insights about it. And if you're asking me for an opinion about it, I think I'll shrink from that. Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here, Mr. Dawkins. The thesis of your book is that we can look at a species today and infer the circumstances of its ancestors. And my question is whether this principle or approach can be applied to memes, particularly the meme of belief in God. Given that theistic religions have popped up and independently emerged all around the world and across diverse cultures, not unlike some examples of convergent evolution, what do you think are the fundamental elements of the human environment or human circumstances that consistently give rise to this meme of believing in a God?
Because I'm sure you're right that it is something that crops up all over the world in all different cultures. I don't think it's that surprising. It's probably partly arises from a natural curiosity that people have why they exist, why the world exists, what it's all about. It's a virtue to have this curiosity, and before science was able to answer such questions, people tended to gravitate towards animism, towards seeing motivation in everything. So instead of just accepting that earthquakes and tornadoes and floods and fires, forest fires and things were the products of the laws of physics, they tended to see agency in them. It was natural to do that, and so you tended to get fire gods and river gods and flood gods and earthquake gods. And then these, perhaps in some cases, tended to coalesce and become monotheistic. I think that from a psychological point of view, it's not difficult to see why all over the world you get convergence on not convergence in the sense of detail, because all religions tend to be different, but tendency to resort to agency kinds of explanations instead of natural explanations.
I'm a huge fan of both of you. Mr. Dawkins, I know you've spoken about time as a physical quality of space, and Alex, I know you've spoken to Dr. Craig about the kalam, and he uses the term sans time. How do you go about explaining to people this concept that there is no before time?
I think you just had this out with Piers Morgan, didn't you? This question of what came before the Big Bang.
Physicists, at least I think most physicists, will say that time began in the Big Bang, and therefore there is no meaning to be attached to the word before when it applies to the Big Bang. I am not a physicist, and there are probably some good physicists in this audience, and I wouldn't presume to attempt to explain why it is that physicists say this, but I think it's one of those things where we have to say our common sense is not necessarily going to give rise to going to do it, and it's very clear if you read a book about relativity or quantum theory that common sense just is out of it. I mean, you can't use common sense, and so when physicists tell me that in their models time began at an instant which they call the Big Bang, I have to submit gracefully and humbly and say it's not my subject.
It's the helpful analogy of the North Pole thing, right? So like if you
yes,
wherever you are on Earth, you can keep going more and more north, but if you got to the North Pole and asked what's north of that, you've misunderstood either the concept of north or the concept of the North Pole, and perhaps asking what came before the Big Bang is similar. And so using Dr. Craig's term of sans time is probably more appropriate there. But it's worth pointing out as well that this is a problem for the theist as well. When Professor Dawkins argued with Piers Morgan about this, well, how can you're an atheist, you have to think that, you have to answer what came before the Big Bang. That doesn't make sense. The theist also believes that God is spaceless and timeless, and so creating the universe with time as one of its properties, they still have to run into this problem of explaining what came before the beginning of time. And so I don't think it's a problem that's unique to this side of the house, as it were.
Thank you for being here, Professor Dawkins and Mr. O'Connor. My cousin and I were here together. We're both evolutionary theists, but we've always appreciated your candor and really enjoyed listening to what you both have to say. My question is, we just came from Francis Ford Coppola's very strange new movie, Megalopolis, and one of the premises of that movie is that human friendliness and cooperation is foremost among the driving forces behind human flourishing as a species, and I wonder what your opinion is on that.
It may be true. I haven't seen the film concerned. I think it's probably true that human friendliness is a major factor. It's not obviously very Darwinian, and I think we might have to invoke a little bit of departure from strict Darwinism to explain the extremes of human friendliness, things like giving to charity, donating blood, that sort of thing, which I think a strict Darwinian, a naive Darwinian would have a hard time explaining things like that. And I think that it comes under the heading of the emergent properties of the human species, which have taken us above and beyond our Darwinian heritage. We're placed in the world by Darwinian natural selection, but our brains have gone further. And so we are perhaps more charitable, friendlier than strict Darwinism would have us be. And I'm delighted by that.
Thank you.
By the way, we're getting near the end here. I wanted to say before the Q&A finishes that if you have a VIP meet and greet ticket, then when the event ends, stay in your seats. Everybody else will leave. Stay in your seats, and you will be told what to do shortly afterwards. If you haven't already picked up your copy of the Genetic Book of the Dead, go and do that at that point, and then return to your seats. And for those who are not VIP meet and greet ticket holders, the Genetic Book of the Dead will.
Good evening, Richard and Alex. So I have a question that I've seen so many religious people raise. This is somewhat hard for me to answer, so I would like to get a response from you. And they point out how scientists will also have like a set of assumptions or axioms that we cannot prove, and we just take them for granted in order for the science just based on pure faith. So they claim that we just have a different set of axioms, and they have a different one. So we have just different faiths, but we are faithful at the bottom. So how would you respond to that?
You're saying that even scientists have axioms which they just have to.
Yeah, that was so the axioms that I'm referring is, for instance, the uniformity of nature, the intelligibility of the universe, or the laws of logic.
Could you talk more slowly?
Yeah, like how we can, like the laws of logic, we just take them for granted. We cannot prove them, or the uniformity of nature. That is the laws of the universe apply in the past, in the future. And that is just an assumption that we take for granted, but we cannot prove that. So it's like a sort of faith, isn't it?
Let's take one of those, the laws of logic, for example. The laws of logic.
Yes.
Which seem foundational to even get going with science. They seem to be things that your brain just thinks are true and can't think are false. It seems like something that can't be proved. So do we not have a level of faith at the basis of the scientific enterprise?
Yes. I suppose 2 + 2 = 4. Is that a matter of faith? Is that what's the kind of thing we're talking about?
Or something like the idea that the laws of physics will continue working in the future, things that we can't necessarily prove, even things perhaps like the existence of the external world and the idea that there are other minds and you're not just sort of in a computer simulation, things which, strictly speaking, you can't prove that that's the case. So is there not some allowed faith in your worldview?
Yes.
And some disallowed faith?
Yes. I mean, well, other minds. I mean, the belief that other people have a consciousness analogous to my own. I know I have a consciousness myself, but how do I know that you do? And I suppose that comes from the feeling that we've come into the world by the same route. We've evolved in the same way. We both were born and we had a childhood and so on in the same way. So solipsism, it can't be disproved, but solipsism, that belief that I'm the only person who exists and all the rest of you are figments of my imagination. Bertrand Russell once got a letter from a woman who said, "Dear Lord Russell, I'm so pleased to hear you're a solipsist. There are so few of us around these days." I suppose that there is a... Thank God I'm not a philosopher, that's all I can say.
I think we've probably got time for just this last one. I'm so sorry everyone else who's queuing up. I suppose this always has to happen at some point, but we're just out of time, I'm afraid. Sorry.
Dear Richard Dawkins, thank you for all the work that you've done. Some people living with schizophrenia, like myself, can experience gods speaking to them that seem more real than just simple hallucinations. Do you think psychotic experiences such as these have played a role in shaping religion or constructing religious narratives?
Aww.
It's a question for Alex, I think.
I mean, actually, the timer is.
Well, I mean, it has been said that certain religious visionaries, like St. Paul, like Muhammad, may have been schizophrenic or may have had some psychological condition like that. It wouldn't surprise me. Also, I suspect that certain hallucinogenic drug states might lead to religious experiences. And I once underwent an experiment of putting a helmet on my head, a man in Canada who claimed to give people religious experiences by passing magnetic fields through the skull.
Okay.
It didn't work for me. I was flown there by the BBC who wanted to see if I had a religious conversion. They had it was a controlled experiment, not a very good controlled experiment. They had a vicar there. He underwent the same experience, and he vigorously denied that it had any effect on him. I'm not quite sure why. I thought he enjoyed it, but anyway, it had no effect on me. I was just a poor subject. I've never tried a hallucinogenic drug. Maybe one day I will.
Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. As I say, if you have a VIP meet and greet ticket, just stay in your seats or go and pick up your book if you haven't already. For the rest of you, please join me once again in thanking, again for the last time, Professor Richard Dawkins. Sam Harris, welcome to Within Reason.
Yeah, great to be here. Great to finally meet you.
Yeah, it's been a long time coming.
Yeah.
Now, a few years ago, or a number of years ago now, on your now deleted Twitter account, you seemed to profess to be able to prove the existence of objective morality using a kitchen stove. Do you still think that's the case? Do you stand by this thread that now doesn't exist anymore? I have it written down here. I thought that maybe we could sort of go through it because you've a couple of times now referred back to it and said, hey, I think this still holds up as a way to prove the existence of objective ethics.
Yeah, it's been years, or at least a year since I saw that thread, so I'm not sure I can, perhaps I can improve on it now in conversation. But yeah, no, I think the argument for objective morality, we can talk about what objective means in that context. I think I'm confident in it. Yeah, I would love to hear your reasons why not.
Yeah, well, I found the thread. I had to sort of go into the depths of Reddit to find a copy somewhere that someone had saved. One of the things that I suppose admire about the moral landscape is that a great deal of the new atheist movement has been criticized. And people talk about new atheism in past tense these days. I don't know if you agree with that assessment, but one of the things it's criticized for is that it sort of knocks down this grand structure of religion and fails to erect anything in its place. The moral landscape was at least an attempt to do that, so that's one thing that I like about it. I suppose, do you agree with that assessment of new atheism?
That it's passé, or that
it's something of a time gone by?
Well, I think it was, I mean, I never felt that it was more than it was, which was mostly just a publishing phenomenon. The four of us had published books in quick succession, and that is me and Richard Dawkins and Dan Dennett and Christopher Hitchens. And then people began to treat us like a four-headed atheist, as though we agreed about everything, which of course we don't. But we agreed about most things relevant to the debate around reason and faith and science and religion. Modulo a few things, a few positive things I would want to put in place of the sort that you just referenced, an objective construal of morality and value, right and wrong, good and evil, and also a contemplative life. I mean, I used spirituality in scare quotes in my book, Waking Up, trying to revive that term. I think that was pretty quixotic. I don't tend to use the term spirituality myself anymore, but what I meant to say is that there's a
clearly an understanding of the furthest reaches of human well-being that we can arrive at ultimately, whether we have it in hand now, that is deeper than culture, that's not parochial, that's not merely a matter of anyone's invention, but it actually speaks to some universal truths about the possibilities of human consciousness and even beyond, conscious machines if we ever build them, etc. So all of that relates, and I think we're going to talk about the moral landscape, all of that relates to questions of value as I construe them, and how a completed science of the mind could ultimately understand them.
And the moral landscape is something of an attack on relativism. This idea that seemed quite popular among secular ethicists, that there's no way to, I suppose, objectively measure different value judgments against each other. I think it's clear that everybody values something. Even if just subjectively, you need to have some kind of motivation to do essentially anything in the world. The interesting question is how we can measure these against each other and determine which one is actually true. And the big selling point of the moral landscape is that this is something we can do with science. So I figured the thread would be a good place to start because it's something of a summary.
Sure.
I suppose we can go through and see who caves in.
Yeah.
So you begin by saying, let's assume that there are no oughts or shoulds in this universe. There is only what is, the totality of actual and possible facts. Second, among the myriad things that exist are conscious minds, susceptible to a vast range of actual and possible experiences. So far, so good. Right? We've got a world of stuff. In that world are conscious minds that can experience things. Number 3 is where it starts to get, I think, controversial. You say, unfortunately, many experiences suck. And they don't just suck as a matter of cultural convention or personal bias. They really and truly suck. If you doubt this, place your hand on a hot stove and report back. What do you mean by suck?
Right, well, so this is a kind of a funny way of hand-waving toward my argument that I refer to in the book and elsewhere as the worst possible misery for everyone. Right? I think you have to grant, the only thing you have to grant really for my argument for objective moral truths to get off the ground is that the universe in which offered as much as it possibly as it could, that universe would be bad. That would be worse than other states of possible universe. Worse by any measure of worse that makes sense. And the moment you move away from the worst possible misery for everyone, things get better, however incrementally, and better by any construal of that word that makes sense. And if you're not going to grant that the worst possible misery for everyone, I mean, it's worth lingering on what those words mean. It's the worst. It's not. It's absolute. There's nothing possible that's worse than this. It's as far as the character of conscious experience, and it's for everyone, right? So there's no, and it's so this is not. There's no story you can tell yourself about how we all get redeemed after this, or we learn a lot of good things that we can only learn this way. There's no silver lining. So this is a perfect hell. Insofar as that's possible. If you're not going to grant that that's bad, then I don't know what you could conceivably mean by the word bad. I mean, there's no application of that term that makes any sense to me. So if we're good, and whether or not you want to judge it as good or bad, whether you want to even entertain those thoughts, if you found yourself in that state, given given what it is to have a mind, and given what it is to have a conscious experience of anything, you will be disposed to move away from the truly intolerable and pointless misery that you've been granted towards anything else that's better, and everything else will be better, right? So it'll be the analogous to taking your hand off a hot stove. So the simplest way for a human being to, in their kitchen, to immediately get to the extremity of this is just, put your hand on a hot stove, or just imagine doing so, and realize how untenable all of your hair splitting will seem. There's no place to stand with your hand on a hot stove as a human being and say, well, maybe this isn't bad, or maybe I have a preference for this, or maybe this is just subjective. Maybe this is just my own personal bias, which suggests that this is bad, right?
I liked the way you used the phrase personal bias in the tweet. You said this isn't just a matter of cultural convention, sure, or personal bias. I suppose I would agree that it's not to do with bias, but when you talk about an experience of sucking, or an experience being the worst kind of suffering imaginable, I suppose what I want to pick up on there is the word worst. You say imagine the worst possible misery for everyone. Presumably when you say worst there, you don't mean something like morally worst, because that would just be to beg the question, right? When you say worst possible misery, you mean something like the most intense amount of suffering, or something like that?
Well, it's bad in any way that things could be bad. So it's, yes, I mean, there's the hot stove is one version of that. I mean, that is for creatures such as ourselves, that is a physical torture, right? And if, you know, I would imagine that even if you had a masochist of some sort, if you just made it hot enough, it would cross into a threshold where, you know, that would be nobody's preference. But there are other things that cause minds like our own to suffer, and so they could be ideas. You know, it could be the knowledge that your kids are, you know, being tortured in the same way in the next room, right? And that, so there's more to suffering than just extreme sensation. I mean, one thing I should add, and I think you're probably headed here anyway, is that there are two senses of the dichotomy, subjective and objective, that we should tease apart, right? There's the ontological one and the epistemological one. And I guess I'll start with the epistemological. The epistemological one is the one that does differentiate between science and non-science, right? So if you're going to be epistemologically objective, that is to say your, you know, epistemology relates to how we know things or think we know things. To be objective in that space is to be dispassionate, not ruled by bias and, you know, confirmation bias or otherwise, to be to use all of the techniques that we learn in science and you know, reasoning generally, to not fool yourself, you know, or not be fooled by others, right? So that your beliefs can more reliably track truth. So without personal bias, or from my saying that this claim is not merely a matter of personal bias, is to say that it's not epistemologically merely subjective, right? And yet the ontological split between subjective and objective is not doesn't cut across the science non-science divide. My argument is that we can be scientific, rigorous, honest, that is epistemologically objective, with respect to subjective facts. Some facts are subjective and some are objective, right? So it's an objective truth about me that my neurotransmitters are in whatever state. It's a subjective truth about me that my experience has a certain qualitative character. And I think many people imagine, and even many scientists imagine, that we can't, it's very difficult to make objective claims about subjective experience. But that's just clearly not true. I mean, we can make an endless number of clearly objective claims about subjective experience, even the subjective experience that we really can't know directly. I mean, the example, I give endless examples here, but and we can objectively say that, you know, in his last hour of life, Winston Churchill was not thinking consciously about how much he wishes he could get, you know, Taylor Swift tickets, right? Or he wasn't thinking about string theory, or I mean, there's an infinite number of things we know he was not thinking, and so those are objective claims about his subjectivity. So that's
yes, and I completely agree, and I think that's actually a really useful jumping off point here for talking about the worst possible misery being bad.
Okay.
Because I completely agree that there are objective truths about subjective states. So it can be objectively true that you are subjectively experiencing suffering, let's say. And if we think about touching the hot stove, when you say that this experience truly sucks, the way that I would interpret a situation like that is that it is objectively true that anybody who puts their hand on a stove will experience an immediate subjective repulsion to that experience. Now, if that's what's going on, it seems to me that the experience itself, let's say the badness of the experience, the part of the experience where I go, I don't like this isn't good, I don't want this for me, that's in the subjective side of the brain. The objective
ontologically,
yes, the objective thing is that subjective experience is being had. And so when we're talking about science determining value, I understand that once you grant that everybody agrees that putting your hand on the stove is bad, everybody agrees that putting the hand on the stove is bad for them at least. Well, once we sort of agree that that's the case, subjectively, that everyone agrees that, there are myriad objective claims that we can make about how to avoid that kind of situation. That's fine. But I'm imagining a world in which everybody subjectively agrees that the color blue is the best color. I don't know what happens to our brain, some kind of pill that everyone's forced to eat, where if we look at any other color, we're just a bit sort of repulsed by it. We think it's disgusting. Maybe it makes us feel a bit queasy, right? And so everybody just agrees that blue is the best color. In the same way that if two roommates are trying to decide what color to paint a room, and they both just happen to subjectively value blue, you can treat it as if it were the case that blue is objectively the best color. You can know objective facts about what to buy and what not to buy when you go to the paint store, right? That's all fine. But if I were to claim that because we both just instinctively prefer the color blue, and because we can know scientifically on the basis of that what color paint to go and buy at the shop, if I were to then say that I can scientifically establish that blue is the best color, that blue is what we should be going for, I think I'd be making a mistake.
Well, so I think if you push the analogy further, I probably don't have a problem with it. So I would acknowledge that there's a boundary, that the boundary between what we might call aesthetics and what we're always tempted to call morality or ethics when things become more important. I think that's fuzzy, and if aesthetic differences were, if you just turned up the dial of their importance, right? So if the difference between we can stick with color, I think it's less visceral for people than taste, but yes, I mean, let's just say that there was a certain color you could see that the pleasure of seeing it was so extraordinary that it just became one of the most important parts of any person's life to just get more of that color, around them, right? And let's say the color was, somehow resource constrained, right? So that, only rich people could get access to it, say. And let's say certain kids were born with a neurological deficit that didn't allow them to appreciate this color, but there was a surgery for that, or drugs they could take for that. The moment you dial up the happiness factor with respect to seeing this color, the more it edges into moral and ethical terrain. Whereas, if you deprive someone of this color, well, then you really are, this is a kind of crime against them, right? And we'd want to send you to prison, right? So, I mean, it sounds very far-fetched, but this is analogous to, like, you can imagine a color so rewarding that it would be the obverse of essentially putting your hand on a hot stove.
Suffering would just become pleasure. In that case, I think that we stop talking in analogy, and we're no longer talking about color as an analogy for pleasure. We're just talking about color as balanced on top of pleasure. We sort of just push the analogy until we're just talking about pleasure again. We'll get back to Sam Harris in just a moment, but first, thinking about the big questions in life can take a heavy toll on our mental health. I've certainly helped connect session with your work, and you can use the link import my channel and see the way that you're on into Sam Harris. I suppose one way of getting at this is the way that you seem to always phrase this. You did in the tweet later on. You say, if we should do anything in this life, we should avoid what really and truly sucks. Elsewhere, you say, look, if bad means anything, it must mean the worst possible misery for everyone. I think a moment ago you said something to that effect. To William Lane Craig, you put it this way: the minimum standard of moral goodness is to avoid the worst possible misery for everyone. If we should do anything in this universe, if we all do anything, if we have a moral duty to do anything, it's to avoid the worst possible misery for everyone. And of course, this seems intuitively true. The problem I have with this is what I would see as a charge of circularity, because it seems to me that the interesting claim that you're making in the moral landscape is that in a world where people think atheists cannot say that certain things are good and bad, if you're an atheist, there is no thing that is good, there is no thing that is bad, there's just stuff. You're saying, no, we actually can say that certain things are bad. We can do that. And someone says, okay, show me how. And you say something like, well, look, if anything is bad, surely the worst possible misery for everyone is bad. But that first bit, that if anything is bad, seems to me the very thing that you're trying to establish. That's the interesting part. So when you say, if we have any duty in this world, it must be to avoid the worst possible misery for everyone.
Mhm.
I could say, but the thing we're trying to establish is if there is any such thing that is dutiful, if there is any such thing as good and bad.
Right.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. So
Mhm.
let's go over this ground again and just notice a few more landmarks. So first, one of the things I do in the moral landscape is point out that there's a double standard with respect to how we treat ethics and morality and the possibility of moral truth and the way we treat every other branch of science or philosophy or reasoning, where, and there's a few ways to see this. In one case, first of all, there's no branch of science or really any intellectual endeavor where you don't have to rely on something that is essentially a brute fact or something that's axiomatic. We pull ourselves up by our bootstraps everywhere. There's no foundation for physics or foundation for arithmetic even that is perfectly self-justifying, so that no one can stand anywhere else and say, well, why did you make that definitional choice, or why, that's not how I choose to think about it, right? It's just that in physics or math, when someone does that, when they have a massively seditious program, right? When someone said, like when we at the physics conference say, physics for us is our understanding how matter and energy behave in this universe. If a biblical creationist or some other person, unqualified for the job, comes in and says, well, no, I want to talk about physics, but I have a different definition, and I would ask you to justify your definition. I mean, how did you come to be so interested in matter and energy? Because for physics, for me, it's just whatever conforms to the Book of Genesis, et cetera, et cetera. Now, in science, and really everywhere, but on questions of ethics or value, when we meet such opposition, we don't draw any conclusions from it. And we just say, you can do whatever you want, but you're not part of our language game. We're not going to take you seriously. There's no temptation to take you seriously. There's nothing about diversity of opinion, even foundational diversity of opinion in those areas, which suggests to us that there might not be any real ground truth to the whole endeavor, right? There's no physicist who's losing sleep saying, Jesus, I thought, physics was on sound footing, and I thought, my investigation of string theory was, headed somewhere, but this creationist showed up and said he didn't even agree with our construal of physics, so that must mean that there is no such thing as physics, or it's just a cultural convention, we just made it up, So there's a double standard. With moral truth and ethical truth and value-laden truth, we say, oh, you're telling me the Taliban don't think it's wrong to force girls to live in bags, and they don't want them to read, and they'll throw battery acid in their face if they decide to learn to read. And they seem to have this alternate morality. So who are we to say that our, colonialist, imperialist, post-enlightenment morality is better or more true, right? We happen to like it more. We don't want to behave this way, but we're not. There's no footing there. So that move for me is specious. The other move, which is I think we have to some degree courtesy of Hume, is this idea that there's this radical disjunction between facts and values. That we can't. There's no way to describe how the universe is that can tell you how it ought to be. And so there's no even the totality of facts couldn't tell you what you should do next unless you add one of your merely human passions to the mix, right? Now, I'm happy to bite the bullet. There's two ways I've addressed that. And it's important to recognize that Hume did not spend a lot of time on that thought. I mean, it's practically marginalia in his work. I mean, it's like about a paragraph and a half or so, if memory serves. So it's not, he did not flesh this out, and yet many people take it as a total defeater against the whole project of uniting facts and values. One thing I would point out, there's two ways I've dealt with this. One is, any discussion of facts presupposes a whole host of values that we don't get for free, but we act like we get them for free. So value in logical consistency, value in evidence, value in elegance if you're in a mathematical field, right? Something like Occam's razor is a value, right? And so you our conversation about what's rational presupposes all sorts of values. And we don't tend to acknowledge it, but if I said to you, listen, I have an amazing theory the physical world, it just so happens, it really is amazing. It's better than anything you're going to get from Ed Witten or anyone else, but it's a little self-contradictory. I mean, so it's like you're going to catch me saying some things that contradict the thing I said just before, and it doesn't make any predictions, right? Okay, so I'm clearly, it's a joke. I'm talking nonsense, and yet that just shows you that I'm running roughshod over some values that are presupposed in any conversation about what's true scientifically. The other move I'm happy to make, though I can talk really on both sides of this, is I'm happy, and this is what I was hand waving toward in that tweet thread, is I'm happy to dispense with this notion of ought and is and moral duty, right? People, one thing I didn't appreciate when I wrote The Moral Landscape is how much people are hung up on this idea that for moral truth to exist, it must contain the motivational component to follow this moral truth. And in addition to the motivation, it must contain an ability to persuade others that they should follow it, right? So if I could tell you that something is really wrong, right? It's some way you and I are living is really wrong. The mere understanding of its wrongness or its moral badness would get us to change our behavior by definition. Otherwise, how are we pretending to understand this? And I just think that's a false claim. But I'm happy. And one analogy I would give is, I mean, just imagine. Here's one case. I'm not actually making this case, but let's say this was true. Let's just say we agreed that vegetarianism is much more ethical than eating meat. And if I happen to eat meat, so I should be a vegetarian. I ought to be a vegetarian. I understand the argument. I see no flaw in it. So the fact that I'm not immediately pushed into vegetarianism proves somehow that this moral reasoning is kind of otiose, right? It's just not, I'm not tracking truth. If I were, the dominoes would just fall. But that's just an unrealistic picture of the human mind. That's not the way the human mind works. And by analogy, I would say, let's say I want to lose 10 pounds. I'm going to just keep this in the dietary space, right? So I want to lose 10 pounds. I'm absolutely sure I understand the physics of this and how I would do it. And it's in fact true of me that I want to lose 10 pounds, say, right? So without any caveat, I know I'll be happier if I lose 10 pounds. I know how to do it. I just need to eat less, and I just persist in eating less than I've been eating currently, and the pounds will disappear. That's just a fact-based description of my situation, but in and of itself is insufficient to get me to go on a diet, because as it happens, I want other things. I like to eat ice cream, preferably once a day, right? So that's not, I realize that's not in harmony with my wanting to lose 10 pounds, but there's more of me than the part of me that just wants to lose 10 pounds, right? So it's the motivation persuasion piece is another part of the conversation, but it doesn't actually dispute the fact that there can be such a thing as moral truth that we could come to understand.
Yeah, that's another thing that David Hume discusses, and it's a big debate within philosophy whether moral facts have to be intrinsically motivating.
Right.
Maybe we can circle around to that, because I want to begin with what you said about this idea of the double standard that exists. And you picture somebody walking into a physics conference and saying, I define physics in this way. And everybody at the physics conference turning around and going, I mean, sure, you can just do that if you want. You can define physics, mean whatever you want, but that's not really what we're talking about. That's not what people care about in this conference. So we're just not going to pay attention to you. Do you, when you publish The Moral Landscape, and there are a great many people in the academy who come out and say, this isn't allowed. Like you say, most people believe in this is-ought distinction. Most people think that good is something other than just well-being. Who's the one walking into the conference here? In other words, like, it seems to me that it might be more like you going into that conference and saying, I think that morality is about well-being, and everyone at the conference turning around and saying, you can do that if you want. I don't exactly have a reason why you can't just say that when I say good, I just mean the avoidance of the worst possible misery for everyone. Sure, but that's not really what we mean. And so do that if you want, but we're not going to sort of pay attention to that.
Yeah,
do you see it that way around, or do you think it's the other way around, that you're the one with the sort of definitional consensus here, that people who are challenging you are coming in and you're the one who should be saying, well, we're not going to pay attention to you?
Well, to be clear, I'm not saying that truth is just a matter of consensus, right?
Sure.
I'm saying that everyone could be wrong. One person could be right. I'm saying that when you're at a conference wherein scientists talk or philosophers talk about morality, I view them as using various double standards and being lured into it, for understandable reasons. But it's like, I've been at a conference. I mean, this was actually one of the things that convinced me to write The Moral Landscape, as I did, is, I was at a conference where, there was kind of an eminent biologist and bioethicist who took me to task for my disparaging the ethics of the Taliban, right? And she said, that's just your opinion that forcing women and girls to live in cloth bags and beating them or killing them if they try to get out, it's not good for them, right? Like, who are you to say that, right? And my point is, who are we not to say that? If we know anything at all about human well-being, and we do, we know that this is not an optimal strategy for maximizing human well-being. And then you start meeting the people who say, well, who's to say that morality has anything to do with human well-being?
Yeah, see, that second step is more interesting to me, because I agree that because we all agree that suffering is bad for us, and I want to talk in a moment about how we go from that. I mean, if I put my hand on a stove, I'm going to want to take it away. It doesn't follow for me that if somebody else puts their hand on a stove, that I'm going to have that same feeling that they should take it away. Well, we'll get to that in a minute, perhaps. But yeah, sure, if we know anything about well-being, we can. It seems fatuous to say, well, that's just your opinion, man. Who are you to say anything? You might as well be saying the same thing about physics, sure. But the problem is that physics is a purely descriptive enterprise, right? If you define things in particular ways, you can just sort of make sure everything's internally consistent, make sure that everyone knows how you're using your terms, and all is well. If you say that good just means something like well-being, if we just say that good is reducible to well-being, then I don't think you so much sort of cross the is-ought divide as just collapsed the ought into an is statement. You sort of created this semantic world in which you can say, whenever I say good, just imagine I'm saying something like avoiding suffering, something like that. I can translate any moral statement now into purely descriptive terms. I can say, it's not good for you to, or it's bad for you to not allow women to vote. And I can just translate that in your terminology as it causes more overall suffering when women can't vote. Now, that can be true and false, cool, now we can do an investigation.
Well,
but it seems like we're not talking about ethics anymore, in other words.
Well, no, again, that's why I think so much of our confusion here, and the reason why it's so well subscribed, is that we have this tradition of how we have carved up the pie of the topics intellectually, and the way we have taught ethics, and the way we've demarcated it from science, and even from the rest of philosophy, and the way we've internally divided it into consequentialism and deontology and virtue ethics, right? I think all of these boundaries tend to be misleading, right? And I think we can clean the slate, and we could in a purely descriptive way, which is to some degree where that tweet thread is pointing. You could say, let's just forget we even had this topic, ethics and morality and good and evil and value, and just forget about, let's be truly naive as to what our circumstance is. We're clearly in a circumstance where there's a wide range of experience on offer, depending on what kind of mind you have. And a few things are true about this, which are clearly true, and I think clearly give us a realistic picture, a philosophically realistic picture of the space in which we are making various truth claims. One is there are horizons past which we can't see, right? That we've only had certain types of experiences, and our nervous systems only allow for certain types of experiences, and we don't know how we would be able to navigate in the space of all possible experience if we changed our nervous systems, or we changed our minds at the level of ideas, which is also a change to the nervous system, obviously. We don't know what experiences would be on offer if the intuitions we had, which could give us this gut sense that certain things are good and bad and right and wrong, if we figured out how to change those and then felt differently about the same things, right? And then we could step back and ask the further question, what would be descriptively, what would be the consequences of that happening? And maybe it's in fact true that if we live in such a universe that if you kept your hand on a hot stove for 30 seconds, you would be ushered into the most sublime experience imaginable for the rest of your life, right? Like your life would be a paradise thereafter, right? And yet none of us have discovered that because, at 29 seconds, we all tap out, right? Now that's just there's no reason to think we live in that universe, but if we did, then it would be morally important to figure out how to get over the 29-second hump on the hot stove, right? Now, leave aside questions of should and ought and duty and good and evil. Let's just admit that we're in this, this is why I call it a moral landscape. We're in this space of possible experiences that admits of peaks and valleys, high spots and low spots with respect to anything that could possibly seem different from one moment to the next, that is valenced in the domain of, I use well-being as a kind of suitcase term for everything that could possibly have this character, that where something seems to matter, right? So it could matter in the sense that, okay, the pain is getting reduced, it could matter in the sense that we're experiencing beauty and creativity we weren't experiencing a moment before, and we value it. Again, we could imagine changing our values. We could imagine saying, actually, we really want to, we've got this, we're going to go to Mars. We're going to be the first people to go to Mars, and we're going to build a community. And we want to be really different than who we were on Earth, and we want to be the cartoon version of this. I think I give in the book. You could imagine an island of perfectly sadists and masochists, right? Who just I can't imagine sadomasochism actually works this way, but just imagine it did, where you could just have people who were being cruel and being made miserable, but they really were finding this incredibly rewarding because of just the kinds of minds they have. They have this sort of S&M reward function. That's conceptually possible from my point of view. And I'm willing to stipulate it might be unrecognizable to me. It might be even odious to me, given my moral intuitions. But it's conceivable we live in a universe where something that strange, from my point of view, could nevertheless be a peak on another peak on a moral landscape, right? Different from the one I'm attempting to ascend.
Sure. There's so much to say. I mean, the first is this idea of beginning with getting rid of ought, duty, should. Just forget about that for a minute, and let's just look at the world we're in. Suppose we're having a conversation with somebody in that world, right? They're just in this descriptive world. There's no ought, there's no should, there's no duty. And we say to them, look, notice what happens when you put your hand on a hot stove. And this person puts their hand on the stove and they pull it away. And you say, so you didn't like that, did you? And they go, no, I really didn't like that. It really hurt. And you say, so you value, not having your hand hurt in that way. And they're like, yeah, so I suppose I do. I mean, I put my hand on it and it just happens. And I then say to them this statement. So look, if we should do anything in this life, and they go, hold on, what do you mean should? What is that? What are you talking about? And I say, okay, if we should do anything, it should be, avoiding those kind of circumstances. And they just say to you, we're in this world where should doesn't exist. What are you talking about there?
I don't think we should draw much of anything from this failure of persuasion, because again, it is like the creationists at the physics conference. But
it's not so much I see what you're saying there, but what I mean to say is I'm trying to get out what you actually mean in that phrase when you say if we should do anything. What do you mean by that?
I'm saying the universe would be better, all things considered. So let's just say we couldn't. Let's say we all have enough brain damage on this point where the sense of should is just something we can never seem to justify, and we're all kind of radically selfish. Whereas even if I can tell you that you would be better off not having your hand on a hot stove, I can't get you to care that anyone else not burn, say. Well, certain things follow. One is given what it is to have a human mind and human relationships, given how social we are, given what, given certain positive states of mind that are on offer, like love and compassion, you'll see this person unable to have certain experiences that we also recognize are sources of happiness, even our primary sources of happiness. Right? So they're going to be cognitively and emotionally closed to really loving their kids. If they can't figure out how the universe is better or to care that it'd be better not having their kids tortured, right? If they only care about their torture, they're limited and there are consequences to that limitation.
When you say the word better there, because I asked what do you mean by should, and you said something like that the world would be better. What do you mean by better?
In precisely the same way that it's better for them, in the way that they acknowledge that their kids not going to be on a hot stove. It's better for their kids not to be tortured in the same way, even if it's viewed from above, not a personal view, just viewed in the totality of.
I suppose my problem is, if that is the case, then in the same way that you can essentially just translate words like good into talking about well-being, I can do the same thing in the opposite direction and translate words like value into things like preference. So if I say something like, look, you put that hand on that stove and you take it away, all that tells me is that I prefer it not to be that way. And I could say that I can convince this person that the world would be better if not. And what do you mean by better? Well, I mean better in the same way that you take your hand away. That is, you would prefer it to be that way.
Yeah, or someone else would prefer it, yeah.
And that's fine, but now it seems like what we're doing is if that is the language that we use, we're saying that the world would be better. This is a good thing to do. Just means this would be a way that people prefer it. And that's fine, but that means that we're talking about moral subjectivity. That's essentially a definition of moral subjectivity, right? That to say good is to say this is what people just prefer.
No, I mean, it's only, I'll grant you that the term preference is deflationary, but it's only deflationary because we reserve it for things that don't really matter, right? The moment you make things matter more and more and more and more and more, and you get into the territory of the worst possible misery for everyone versus its antithesis, some sublime state of satisfaction that endures for as long as possible for everyone capable of it. And the difference, the gulf that opens up between those two states of the universe or any, microcosm within that universe, that gulf is not, to traverse that gulf with the term preference is just, it seems like a misuse of how we use that term, right? Mm-hmm. It only seems deflationary because of what we do with it. But yes, what matters, the fact of mattering, the objective fact of anything mattering is a subjective reality. I'll grant you that. And this is the split between ontological and subjectivity and objectivity. It's not a matter for rocks and quasars. It's a matter for conscious systems to notice the difference in, right? So without consciousness, the world of value goes away, right? It's got to matter to someone, somewhere, somehow, at least possibly, right? So if it's, I would grant that it could potentially affect an experience as opposed to actually affect an experience and still matter. But
Sure.
If there's something out there that couldn't possibly affect anyone's experience, now or in the future, no matter what happens, well, then that thing doesn't matter, right? But by definition, in my world. So it's not a bug of my view. Rather, it's a feature that it captures what we care about, in my view, in when we talk about right and wrong, good and evil.
Yeah.
And I think it does count. You can talk about should and duty, but those are, I will grant, it's not a lot hinges on whether that strand of the conversation succeeds for me. It's because one of the entailments of my view is that we really are radically ignorant as to what is possible and what is real ultimately.
Mm-hmm.
Even one of the knocks against consequentialism and utilitarianism, which I admit, and it's profoundly inconvenient, is that it's very difficult to know when to stop gathering data so as to judge any act to be good or evil. So it's like, is Putin's invasion of Ukraine bad or good? Well, I certainly think it's bad. I'm reacting as though it's bad. I'm condemning him as though it's bad. I think he had bad intentions. I think he's a bad person. I think there's a lot of evidence for that. But what if the invasion of Ukraine and all the misery endured there by the Ukrainians and all the needless destruction of life and property somehow does something to world affairs that 30 years from now we recognize, okay, that was actually the thing to get our heads screwed on straight.
Put the hand on the stove for 30 seconds.
Yeah. right? So it's actually, it was, in hindsight, it was the best thing in 500 years. Right now, I have no reason to think that's true. I would highly doubt anyone suspecting that that is true, but I can't rule out that possibility, right? So that's contained in this analysis, right? So the thing that really confounds people, and it's the thing that is just a perpetual engine of misunderstanding of my view, is that people immediately move to the claims I'm making about moral truth to an effort to adjudicate practical moral decisions that exist very much in the gray area of, there are trade-offs and calculations we can't do, and who knows what in the final analysis is really morally true. What's going to be better for any individual or the greatest number of individuals? And this comes to the distinction I make in the book around answers in practice and answers in principle, right? So what I'm saying is that there are answers in principle, ultimately, at the end of the conversation, a billion years from now, where we can cash out our truth claims as being real, right, or having been real. There might not be answers in practice, and yet, again, this is a double standard in science. There are an infinite number of questions for which we don't have answers in practice, and yet no one would be tempted to say there's no truth there.
Of course, yeah. How many stars are there in the Milky Way precisely?
Exactly.
Who knows?
And what is their weight? And it's just changed, right?
For what it's worth, I mean, all of this is fine in that
right.
There seems to sort of be two steps in the moral enterprise here. One is make all kinds of scientific claims, and this is where it becomes relevant to talk about how people will object, but you can't know in practice, but there is a principal answer. All of that stuff, I'm totally with you on. Like everything on that side, I completely agree. It doesn't matter that we can't know in practice, whether we should cure cancer or racism. Like that doesn't matter. There could be.
But that's the kind of pushback I get even from moral philosophers. They'll say, "Well, I don't know how to measure well-being, right?
Sure,
Give me a device." But so look, I hear that you're concerned about the definition of well-being and that it's not precise and that it couldn't be precise.
It's not that it's not precise. It's that I suppose, and I'll be interested to see what you think of this. When you've spoken to Daniel Dennett about free will,
right?
And most people listening will probably be familiar. You don't believe in free will. Daniel Dennett is a compatibilist. He believes that there is free will, and you've had sort of a lot of back and forth about it. And one of the things that happened in this debate is Daniel Dennett puts forward this thing, which he says, look, I can, the actions that I'm performing, they come from somewhere within me. They're due to my will, all of this kind of stuff. And so that's freedom. And you accused him of something that I think you coined as the Atlantis fallacy. You said, look, you're describing this thing, and you're saying, if free will means anything, surely it's got to mean like something to do with the action not being inhibited by exterior forces, it coming from somewhere in my brain, this kind of stuff. And because it fulfills all of those criteria, it's free will. And you say, this is a bit like saying, you're trying to prove the existence of Atlantis, and you say, here's this city, and it's watery, and it's old, but you're actually pointing at Venice. And you say, but what is this Atlantis that you're talking about? Atlantis is a sort of slightly, it's this watery city, it's really old, like, it fulfills some of the criteria, sure, but it's not what people mean when they say Atlantis, right? And that's the criticism you've made of Daniel Dennett. Now,
he's changed the subject.
What I want to do is make the same criticism here of you, that you're doing the Atlantis fallacy with ethics, where you say, look at this thing called well-being. It seems intimately connected to things that we value. It seems intimately connected to all sort of forms of moral systems that people have devised. Despite what they might claim is the basis of ethics, it's always got something to do with well-being. And you're pointing at this thing called well-being and saying this fulfills so many criteria. And that's the equivalent of you pointing to Venice and me saying, sure, it does do that, but when people say Atlantis, they mean something else. And when people say good, they just mean something else.
Yeah, so that's I would be happy to dispute that. It's because in Dan's case, I can point to what he's leaving out. Right, he's leaving out something I think crucial. He is in fact changing the subject. Here, my definition of well-being, again, it's not a definition. It's just tell me what matters to you. Tell me what I'm leaving out. Tell me, and so if you're a fundamentalist Christian, you'll say, well, for me, it's all about this world doesn't matter at all. Really, it's just a matter of who goes to heaven and who goes to hell. Right? It's just following God's law. Well, that's just another circumstance of suffering and its antithesis, right? It's you're concerned about your conscious life beyond the grave. Now you might be wrong. In fact, you very likely are wrong about whether Christianity is correct, you know, in the physics of things. But let's say you're right. Well, then I'll grant you, yeah, nothing's more important than not winding up in hell, right?
Sure.
You know, so.
But the way you would just like, well, tell me what you value. If it's not well-being, what
Well,
is it?
tell me what I'm leaving out. What could I be leaving out?
Well,
So
I do value well-being. I do. I suppose what I'm saying is I just think that is a subjective preference that I have. I just have this subjective preference for my own well-being, and.
But I want to follow the move you just made with respect to Dan. You're saying that my definition of well-being, however capacious, is guaranteed to leave out what some people legitimately mean by good or evil or etc.
Yeah.
So what are those things?
Well, I think the tricky thing is, and I can offer a few different answers from different, I guess, moral perspectives. I mean, I'm an emotivist about ethics, so I don't have a what I would say is whatever that gap is, I think just doesn't exist. But some people might say, for example, when you speak to a religious person and you say, what do you value if not well-being, or what is missing from that picture? They might say something like, well, yes, the worst possible misery for everyone is bad, and that there's no way of conceiving of that situation that wouldn't be bad. But it's not bad just because of, say, the suffering. It might be the case, for example, that you're an Aristotelian and you think that things have natural ends. You know, this table's end is to hold things up, you know, and a human's end is to fulfill whatever, you know, the human end is. And suffering doesn't fulfill that. But they'll say that the reason that it's bad is because suffering doesn't fulfill the natural end of man or something. It's not because it's suffering. It's not because the experience of suffering is something that the creatures who feel it subjectively don't like. And so they'll totally agree with you that, yeah, the worst possible misery for everyone is bad, but that isn't enough to show me that it's bad because it involves the suffering, you know. And so they'll say that what you're missing there is that. Now, I wouldn't say that because I'm not an Aristotelian, but then I wouldn't say that this good concept exists objectively, right? And so I'd be the wrong person to ask. But I think it would be something like that, right? And you must recognize that, at least on the surface, when you tell people, I think morality is about well-being, and they sort of meet you with suspicion, that there must be something about this word good, even if they can't quite pin down what it is, that means more than just that.
Yeah, well, so I'll grant you that people have different associations with all of these terms, and many of those associations are confusing. I mean, that they make it's very easy to misunderstand what I'm saying if you have a fairly effete conception of well-being or happiness. Or I mean, they don't sound like substantial terms. It sounds like you know, when you're thinking about what spa you want to go to on the weekend, then you're thinking about your well-being. But you know, when your kid's getting tortured in the next room, well-being is not the framing that makes sense. But I'm using well-being and even a lighter term like happiness versus suffering to run as deep as we can possibly go, and deeper than that if we only had minds that could go deeper than that, right? So it's just, again, I'm willing to dispense with the conventional terminology in order to just reset the conversation and descriptively explore this space of all possible experience, right? So what are the concepts? If you don't like words like good and evil, how do you want to think about a space where you individually and we collectively as conscious beings have a navigation problem, right? Like where morality is essentially the demand that is being imposed on us by reality, the reality that we are as conscious beings and whatever reality in which we're entangled. The demand is being made on us at each moment to do or not do something next, right? Like we're continually tacking in some unseen wind and experiencing the results of that movement.
Yeah.
And we're, you could imagine beings like ourselves where they have a very different language. The conceptual layer that applied to this navigation could be very different, and it might not be easy to translate our moral talk into their talk about these changes. Right?
Maybe you can tell me what I'm missing from my picture then, because like I say, I'm broadly speaking an ethical emotivist.
But say more about the consequences of that. What does that mean?
I'm not sort of, I don't know, I always like to be a little bit agnostic about these things, you know, open to change and all that, but I'm broadly attracted to this view that when we make ethical statements or pronouncements, we're essentially just expressing emotions at each other. And so when I say that murder is wrong, I'm sort of expressing some kind of distaste, or I'm expressing something akin to saying, don't do that, which is just like a command. It doesn't have any truth value. It's not even subjectively true or false. It's just like a command or an expression. And so if that's the case, then this sort of ethical talk is completely different to the picture that you're painting. And so,
no, not really. I can translate some of that into the picture I'm painting, because again, it sounds like to say that it's just a statement about the way we feel or might feel.
Well, it's not. To be clear, it's not a statement about how we feel. It is the expression of the feeling. So, the mistake that's often made with the motivism is when I say murder is wrong, I'm not saying something like I don't like murder or I feel bad towards murder, because that can be true and false. As we were discussing earlier, it can be true that I don't like murder. It's the expression of the dislike to the murder. So AF famously has it as just going, boo murder. You know, that's not something that has any kind of truth value. And
boo doesn't, but you're granting that it is possible to not like murder, and that could be an objective state of a subjective system.
Yeah, that's no problem at all.
Yeah,
sure.
Okay.
And so I find myself in a world where I put my hand on a hot stove, and when I do, I go, I don't like that. And it's objectively true that I don't like that. Cool. And so I look around the world, and there are certain experiences that are going to make me suffer, and some that are not. And so I pick the ones that don't make me suffer because I prefer them. And like, that's it, man. That's the story.
Okay, well, let's build from there. So that's you as the emotivist, picking and choosing in the space of possible experience. Would you grant that there are experiences you haven't had and you don't know what you're missing?
Yes, in terms of what I would, if experiencing those, you know, subjectively enjoy. Sure.
Right. So, and it might be there are circumstances where there are experiences that are available to people and, you know, other conscious minds, but they're not available to you given how you are, right? So you might not have the talent required to get there, or the genes required to get you there.
Absolutely, yeah, no problem.
Okay, so the landscape of possible experience extends what you currently know or even can know, right? And that's true of every person like you.
Absolutely, yeah,
We're saying boo at each other in that context.
And this landscape we're talking about is a landscape of experiences, either possible or actual, which, if I were to experience them, I would go, yay. I'd go, yeah, sure, great.
But the yay, the thumbs up and thumbs down can be increasingly strident, right? I mean, like, there's experiences that are so good.
Absolutely,
that you'll have the experience of everything that's happened up to me, up to this moment in my life, it was comparatively worthless compared to this experience that I'm now having.
Sure.
And obviously the opposite is the case. So what do you make of the fact that these experiences exist, right? And they're radically different, and that there are right and wrong answers with respect to how to get from one to the other. It's not, you don't randomly get just hurled toward one or the other.
Sure.
You know, it's there are at every level that we can understand ourselves scientifically, from the genome on up. You know, so genetics and neuroscience and psychology and sociology, if that were actually a science. Economic systems, everything, every contribution to a possible change in the character of our experience can be more or less well understood.
Absolutely,
rapidly.
yeah, no problem with that either.
So all those converging lines of fact-based discussion can be brought to bear on this navigation problem.
Yeah, so because I've got this subjective preference to reach this peak, I can use all of the scientific resources available to me to go and reach that peak.
Okay, now what if we just add one other element to this, which is you've got your preference weights such as they are now. You got the factory settings, but you know, you didn't pick your parents, you didn't pick your genes, you didn't pick the factory, you didn't pick your culture and the world into which you were born, and you've been tuned up by forces beyond your control. Now we have something like a completed science of the mind, and you can actually change your preferences.
Okay.
Right? There's this additional question of whether you should do that, whether that would be a good thing to do, but good as measured by what?
Well, in my universe, we don't have terms like good yet. That haven't entered into.
So that you'll just say boo differently
Yeah.
if we change those weights, right?
So let's say like somebody offers me the opportunity to take a pill,
Mhm.
and let's say that in this world I don't really like music that much.
Right.
So I don't really care for it, whatever. And I can take a pill that's suddenly going to turn me into this great music lover, where I'm going to experience this brand new joy. And although right now my preference isn't to enjoy music, so it doesn't seem to matter to me, I can change my preferences so that now this new pleasure opens up to me and I can experience it. What would I do? I'd look at that pill and I'd go, yeah, sounds great, awesome, and I'd take the pill just because I would prefer to have that preference. It's a second order preference, right? But there's still no space here into which I prefer, and I use my scientific analysis of the world to